You have 30 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't destroy everything you've built with one phone call. The words came out steadier than I expected, considering my hands were shaking as I held the phone. Charles Whitmore, the man who was supposed to marry me in less than 12 hours, stood frozen in the doorway of what should have been our honeymoon suite. His face had gone completely white. You know what they say about karma, it doesn't always come when you want it, but it always comes when you need it. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of timing, delivering justice right when you think you've lost everything. I'm curious, how are you all doing today? Where are you watching from? I hope wherever you are, the weather's treating you better than life was treating me that night. My name is Aaliyah Johnson, and this is the story of how I went from being a billionaire's disposable bride to the woman who held his entire empire in her hands. Picture this. Me standing in $1,000 silk robe, phone pressed to my ear, watching the most powerful man in corporate America realize that his perfect plan had just become his perfect nightmare. But before I tell you how I got my revenge, let me ask you something. Have you ever subscribed to a channel that completely changed how you see the world? Well, you're about to. Hit that subscribe button because this story is going to take you places you never expected. Trust me, you'll want to hear every single word of what happens next. But let me start from the beginning, back when I was naive enough to believe that love could bloom in the most unlikely places. I was 26 when I first met Charles, and I believed in fairy tales. Not the Disney kind. I wasn't that naive, but I believed that successful, intelligent people could fall in love across any divide. I believed that when someone looked you in the eye and told you that you were extraordinary, they meant it. I believed that when a man introduced you to his family, his friends, his business partners, it was because he was proud to have you by his side. Most of all, I believed that when Charles Whitmore, heir to a shipping fortune worth $3 billion, got down on one knee in front of 200 people at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and asked me to marry him, it was because he loved me. I should have known better. The signs were there from the very beginning, hidden in plain sight like landmines in a beautiful garden. The way he always scheduled our public appearances, but rarely wanted to spend quiet evenings together. How he knew exactly which photographers would be at which events, almost like he was performing for an audience I couldn't see. The strange phone calls he would take in another room, always ending just as I walked in. But I was so grateful to be chosen. That's the thing about growing up as a Black woman in America. Sometimes when someone powerful picks you, you're so shocked by the selection that you forget to question the motive. Charles was handsome, successful, and he seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. When he laughed at my jokes, when he held my hand at charity galas, when he introduced me as the brilliant Aaliyah Johnson to his business associates, I felt like I was living in a dream. The engagement happened fast. 6 months of dating, then that very public proposal. The ring was a 10-carat diamond that caught light from across a room. The wedding planning was a whirlwind of the finest everything, designers flying in from Paris, flowers imported from Ecuador, a guest list that read like a who's who of American power. I threw myself into becoming the perfect bride for Charles Whitmore. I learned about wine regions I'd never heard of, studied art history so I could hold conversations at gallery openings, even took private lessons in classical music appreciation. I wanted to be worthy of the life he was offering me. What I didn't know was that Charles had never intended for me to actually live that life. The first crack in my perfect world came 3 weeks before the wedding. I was at Charles's penthouse, going over final details with the wedding planner, when his phone rang. He stepped onto the balcony to take the call, but the sliding door didn't close completely. I heard fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. The optics are perfect. Minority outreach program. Board will love it. Temporary arrangement. When he came back inside, I asked him who had called. Just business, he said, kissing my forehead. Nothing for you to worry about, beautiful. But I was starting to worry about everything. The second crack came when I overheard his mother talking to his sister at the bridal shower. I was coming back from the bathroom when I heard Victoria Whitmore's voice, sharp and clear. "It's actually quite clever, what Charles is doing. The marriage will last just long enough to secure the Lynch deal, then he can quietly divorce her and marry someone more suitable. The prenup ensures she gets almost nothing." I stood in that hallway, designer dress suddenly feeling like a costume, and realized I had been cast in a play where I didn't know my real role. The final crack came the night before our wedding, when I found the real prenuptial agreement hidden in Charles's study. Not the one his lawyers had shown me, the one that gave me a modest settlement and some security. This one was different. This one had a clause I'd never seen before, buried in legal language that took me 3 readings to understand. If the marriage ended within the first year, I would receive nothing. Not the settlement we discussed, not the security I'd been promised, nothing. And there was something else, a timeline that made my stomach drop. The Lynch Industries merger, the deal that would make Charles the youngest billionaire in shipping history, was scheduled to close exactly 11 months and 3 weeks after our wedding date. Just under the 1-year mark. That's when I understood. I wasn't Charles Whitmore's bride. I was his business strategy. A prop in a performance designed to win over Lynch Industries' board, who had been vocal about wanting to work with companies that demonstrated progressive values and commitment to diversity. Charles had chosen me not because he loved me, but because I was the perfect accessory for his ambition. Smart enough to be credible, successful enough in my own right to avoid suspicion, and black enough to check the box he needed checked. The wedding was supposed to be a beginning. Instead, it was designed to be an elaborate countdown to my disposal. But Charles Whitmore had made one crucial mistake in his perfect plan. He had assumed that I was as powerless as he needed me to be. He had never bothered to learn who I really was, what I was really capable of, or what I really knew. And what I knew was about to destroy everything he thought he had built. As I stood in that honeymoon suite, phone in my hand, watching the man who had planned to abandon me realize that his victim had become his judge, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not just anger, not just hurt, but a crystalline clarity about exactly what justice was going to look like. 30 seconds, Charles, I repeated, my voice growing stronger with each word. Tell me why I shouldn't make that call. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd known him, Charles Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say. And that's when I knew I had already won. Let me take you back to where this all really began, because understanding how I got to that moment requires knowing who I was before Charles Whitmore decided I was useful. I grew up in Detroit, raised by my grandmother after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. Grandma Rose worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, and she taught me 2 things that shaped everything about who I became. First, that intelligence was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. Second, that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I should have remembered that second lesson. By 26, I had built something I was genuinely proud of. My consulting firm, Johnson Strategic Solutions, specialized in helping corporations navigate complex regulatory environments. I wasn't just successful. I was the person other successful people called when they needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. My client list included 3 Fortune 500 companies, and I had a reputation for being brilliant, discreet, and absolutely reliable. That reputation was how I first met Charles. It was 18 months before our wedding, at a conference on international trade regulations. I was giving a presentation on navigating maritime shipping laws when I noticed him in the 3rd row, leaning forward with genuine interest. After my talk, he approached me with what seemed like thoughtful questions about compliance strategies for family-owned shipping companies. "I'm Charles Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. "And I think you might be exactly what my company needs." He was handsome in that effortless way that comes with generations of good breeding and better nutrition. Tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, and eyes that seemed to actually see you when he looked at you. But what impressed me wasn't his looks, it was how he listened. When I talked about regulatory frameworks, he asked follow-up questions that showed he understood not just what I was saying, but why it mattered. "Would you be interested in consulting for Whitmore Shipping?" he asked. "We're expanding into some new markets, and frankly, we need someone who understands the landscape better than we do." That's how it started. Professional meetings that gradually became longer, more personal conversations. Charles would ask my opinion on business strategies that had nothing to do with regulations. He seemed genuinely curious about my background, my education, my thoughts on everything from market trends to social issues. "You see things differently than most people in my world," he told me one evening after a particularly productive strategy session. "It's refreshing." The first time he asked me to dinner, I almost said no. Dating clients was a line I'd never crossed, and Charles Whitmore represented the kind of business relationship that could transform my company. But there was something about the way he asked, not presumptuous or entitled, but almost uncertain, like he wasn't sure I'd say yes. "I know this complicates things professionally," he said, "but I'd really like to get to know you outside of conference rooms and shipping manifests." That dinner changed everything. Away from business, Charles was charming, funny, and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone who'd grown up with more money than most people could imagine. He told me stories about boarding school mishaps and family vacations that went hilariously wrong. He asked about my grandmother, my childhood in Detroit, my dreams beyond building my consulting firm. "I've never met anyone like you," he said as we walked along the waterfront after dinner. "You're brilliant, obviously, but there's something else. You're real in a way that most people in my world aren't." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. The relationship developed slowly, carefully. Charles was respectful of my boundaries, patient with my schedule, and genuinely interested in my work. When I landed a major contract with a pharmaceutical company, he took me out to celebrate and listened for 2 hours as I explained the regulatory challenges I'd helped them navigate. "You're going to change how business gets done," he told me that night. "Companies like mine have been operating this same way for generations. We need people like you to show us what we're missing." 6 months into our relationship, Charles started introducing me to his world. Gallery openings where I met artists whose work I'd only seen in magazines. Charity galas where I found myself seated next to senators and Supreme Court justices. Business dinners where I realized my opinions were not just welcomed, but actively sought out. "Aaliyah has some fascinating insights on international trade policy," Charles would say, and suddenly I'd find myself in conversations with people who shaped global economic policy. I felt like I was living in a fairy tale, but one where I'd earned my place through intelligence and hard work rather than magic. Charles's friends and family seemed to genuinely like me. His mother, Victoria, was initially cool but gradually warmed up, especially after I helped her navigate a complex legal issue with one of her charitable foundations. "You're good for Charles," she told me one evening at a family dinner. "He's more thoughtful when you're around. More engaged with the world beyond business." His sister Emma was even more welcoming. "I've never seen my brother this happy," she confided during a shopping trip she'd insisted on taking me on. "He talks about you constantly. It's actually kind of annoying." But it was Charles's business partner and best friend, David Lynch, who seemed most impressed by our relationship. David was heir to Lynch Industries, the massive conglomerate that had been the Whitmore family's biggest competitor for 3 generations. "You know, Charles bringing you into his life might be the smartest business decision he's ever made," David told me at a dinner party. "My board has been pushing for partnerships with companies that demonstrate real commitment to diversity and progressive values. Having someone like you as part of the Whitmore family would go a long way toward making that happen." At the time, I thought he was complimenting Charles's choice in women. I didn't realize he was describing a business strategy. The proposal came exactly 1 year after we started dating, at a charity auction for arts education that Charles had insisted we attend together. I thought we were there to support a good cause. I had no idea we were there for a performance. Halfway through the evening, Charles stood up and asked for the microphone. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom, "but I have something important to say." My heart started racing as he turned to look at me. Around us, 200 of the most influential people in the city fell silent. "Aaliyah," he said, walking toward my table, "you've changed my life in ways I never expected. You've made me a better man, a better businessman, and a better human being. You've shown me what it means to build something meaningful, not just profitable." He dropped to one knee right there in front of everyone, pulling out a ring box that caught the light from the chandeliers above us. "Will you marry me?" The room erupted in applause before I could even answer. Cameras flashed from every direction. People were already standing, already celebrating, already treating my yes as a foregone conclusion. And in that moment, surrounded by all that noise and light and expectation, I said the word that sealed my fate. Yes. The engagement party was held at the Whitmore family estate 3 weeks later. 500 guests, a full orchestra, and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. I felt like Cinderella, except instead of a fairy godmother, I had a team of stylists, planners, and publicists making sure every detail was perfect. "You look radiant," Charles whispered in my ear as we danced to our first song as an engaged couple. "I can't wait to make you my wife." The wedding planning consumed the next 6 months of my life. Charles insisted on the best of everything. A designer who'd dressed 3 princesses for my gown, a florist who'd done arrangements for the White House, a venue that required a 2-year waiting list unless your name was Whitmore. "Nothing's too good for my bride," he kept saying, and I believed him. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. How Charles always seemed to know which events would have the most media coverage. How he made sure we were photographed together at every opportunity. How our engagement announcement appeared in not just the society pages, but the business section of every major newspaper. "Power couple takes on corporate America," read one headline. "Whitmore Heirs' engagement signals new era of inclusive leadership," read another. I thought they were celebrating our love story. I didn't realize they were documenting a business transaction. The first rail warning came during a dinner with David Lynch and his wife 6 weeks before the wedding. We were discussing honeymoon plans when David made a comment that stopped me cold. "You two should definitely take your time," he said, raising his wine glass. "Enjoy being newlyweds. The Lynch-Whitmore merger can wait until you're back and settled." I looked at Charles, confused. "Merger? I thought your companies were competitors." Charles laughed, but it sounded forced. "David's getting ahead of himself. We've discussed some potential partnerships, but nothing's decided." "Oh, come on," David said, clearly having had too much wine. "The board's already approved it. Your marriage is going to make this the easiest deal we've ever closed. Progressive values, commitment to diversity, all that good stuff the shareholders love to hear about." The table went quiet. Charles's jaw was tight, and David's wife was shooting her husband warning looks. "What David means," Charles said carefully, "is that our relationship has helped both companies think more broadly about partnerships and collaboration." But I heard what David had actually said. Our marriage wasn't just a symbol of progressive values. It was a tool to secure them. That night, I asked Charles directly about the merger. "Is there something you're not telling me about your business relationship with David?" "Aaliyah, you're overthinking this," he said, pulling me close. David had too much wine and got carried away. "Yes, our companies have discussed working together, but that has nothing to do with us. I'm marrying you because I love you, not because of some business deal." He kissed me then, soft and reassuring, and I let myself believe him. Because the alternative, that the man I loved had chosen me as a business strategy, was too devastating to consider. But the seed of doubt had been planted. And over the next 6 weeks, as I noticed more and more things that didn't quite add up, that seed began to grow into something that would eventually destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The morning I found that hidden prenuptial agreement, the morning I realized that Charles had never intended our marriage to last, I finally understood what my grandmother had tried to teach me all those years ago. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Charles had been showing me who he was from the very beginning. I just hadn't wanted to see it. But now I could see everything. And what I saw was about to change both of our lives forever. The morning of our wedding dawned gray and drizzling, which should have been my first sign that the universe was trying to warn me. I woke up in the bridal suite at the plaza, surrounded by bridesmaids who were more excited about the event than I was. My stomach had been in knots for 3 days, ever since I'd found that hidden prenuptial agreement. I hadn't confronted Charles about it yet. Part of me kept hoping there was an explanation, some reason why there were 2 different versions of our prenup that didn't involve him planning to dispose of me like a used business card. But every time I looked at my phone, thinking about calling him, I remembered David Lynch's drunken words about the merger and how easy our marriage would make it. "Aaliyah, you need to eat something," my maid of honor, Jessica, said, holding out a plate of fruit that might as well have been cardboard for all the appetite I had. "I'm fine," I lied, staring at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was stunning, the kind of bride that would grace magazine covers. My dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that had taken 6 months to create. My makeup was flawless, my hair an elegant updo that had taken 3 hours to perfect. I looked like every little girl's dream of a princess bride. I felt like a fraud. "You're just nervous," Jessica said, misreading my expression. "Every bride gets cold feet. Charles loves you. Anyone can see that." But could they? Or were they seeing what Charles wanted them to see? The same performance he'd been giving for 18 months. My phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "Can't wait to see you at the altar, beautiful. Today is going to be perfect." Perfect. That word had been following me around for weeks. The perfect dress, the perfect venue, the perfect guest list. Everything about this wedding was perfect except for the growing certainty that the groom was marrying me for all the wrong reasons. I was still staring at the text when Jessica's phone rang. She answered it, then held it out to me with a confused expression. "It's for you. Someone named Patricia Ferdinand from Lynch Industries." My blood went cold. Lynch Industries. David's company. The one that was supposedly going to merge with Whitmore Shipping after our marriage made it politically palatable. "Hello," I said, taking the phone. "Miss Johnson, I'm so sorry to bother you on your wedding day," Patricia said, her voice professional but urgent. "I'm the head of legal affairs at Lynch Industries. I need to speak with you about something extremely time-sensitive." "I'm getting married in 4 hours," I said, my voice barely steady. "I know, and I wouldn't call if this wasn't critical." "Miss Johnson, are you aware that your marriage to Charles Whitmore is a key component of the Lynch-Whitmore merger agreement?" The room started spinning. "What do you mean, a key component?" "The merger documents specifically reference your marriage as evidence of Whitmore Shipping's commitment to diversity and progressive leadership. The board made it clear that this partnership was contingent on that commitment being demonstrated through concrete action, not just words." I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, my perfect dress pooling around me like spilled cream. "Miss Johnson, are you there?" "I'm here," I whispered. "There's something else. We've discovered some irregularities in the merger timeline that suggest this marriage may not be permanent. If that's the case, if this is some kind of temporary arrangement designed to secure the deal, Lynch Industries could face serious legal and reputational consequences." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "What kind of irregularities?" "Financial projections that assume the marriage will end within a year. Insurance policies that specifically exclude spousal benefits after 12 months. And a prenuptial agreement that we weren't supposed to see, one that's very different from the version that was shared with our legal team. The hidden prenup." Someone at Lynch Industries had seen it. Ms. Johnson, I need to ask you directly. Do you have any reason to believe that Charles Whitmore intends to divorce you shortly after this merger is completed? I closed my eyes, thinking about all the signs I'd ignored, all the moments that suddenly made terrible sense. The way Charles always seemed to be performing our relationship for an audience. How he'd insisted on such a public proposal, such an elaborate wedding. The timeline that would end our marriage just before the 1-year mark that would trigger my financial protections. Yes, I said, the word coming out like a confession. I think that's exactly what he intends to do. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Ms. Johnson, if you proceed with this marriage knowing it's designed to defraud Lynch Industries, you could be considered complicit in securities fraud. But if you're willing to help us prove what's really happening here, we might be able to protect both you and our company. What are you asking me to do? Wear a wire to your wedding. The words hit me like a physical blow. You want me to spy on my own wedding? We need evidence of Charles's real intentions. If he admits that this marriage is temporary, that it's designed to secure the merger under false pretenses, we can stop this before it destroys both of our companies and your life. I looked around the bridal suite, at Jessica and my other bridesmaids who were pretending not to listen, at the flowers and champagne and all the trappings of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. If I do this, I said slowly, and you get the evidence you need, what happens then? Lynch Industries withdraws from the merger. Charles Whitmore faces potential criminal charges for securities fraud. And you walk away from this marriage with proof that you were the victim, not the accomplice. The alternative was clear. Go through with the wedding, let Charles use me to secure his deal, then watch him discard me a year later with nothing to show for it, but the humiliation of being publicly abandoned by a man who'd never loved me. How long do I have to decide? The ceremony starts in 4 hours. If you're going to do this, we need to get the equipment to you within the next hour. I looked at myself in the mirror again, at the beautiful bride who was about to make the most important decision of her life. Not about whether to marry Charles Whitmore. That decision had been made for me the moment I found that hidden prenup. But about whether to go down as his victim or his downfall. Send the wire, I said. An hour later, a woman who introduced herself as a private investigator was in my bridal suite, carefully attaching a tiny recording device to the inside of my dress. It was so small and well hidden that even I couldn't feel it once it was in place. The range is about 50 feet, she explained. It'll pick up any conversation you have clearly. Just try to get him talking about his real plans for the marriage. What if he doesn't say anything incriminating? Then you'll have a recording of your wedding vows, and you can decide what to do with the rest of your life knowing you tried to get the truth. As she packed up her equipment, I realized that everything had changed. I wasn't walking down that aisle as Charles Whitmore's naive bride anymore. I was walking down it as an undercover agent in my own wedding, gathering evidence that would either save me or destroy us both. Miss Johnson, the investigator said as she reached the door, for what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. Brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified, heartbroken, and completely alone. But I also felt something else, something I hadn't experienced in weeks of wedding planning and doubt. I felt like I had some control over my own story again. 2 hours before the ceremony, Charles called. "How's my beautiful bride?" he asked, his voice warm and loving in a way that now made my skin crawl. "Perfect," I said, the word tasting like poison. "Everything's perfect. I can't wait to see you walking down that aisle. You're going to take everyone's breath away." "Charles," I said, my heart pounding, "can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "Are you happy?" "Really, truly happy about what we're doing today." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. "Of course I'm happy. Why would you ask that?" "I just want to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. Aaliyah, we're doing this because we love each other. Because we want to build a life together. Because you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." The words were perfect. Too perfect. Like he'd rehearsed them. I love you too, I said, and for the first time in our relationship, I was the one who was lying. After I hung up, I sat in that bridal suite and made peace with what I was about to do. In a few hours, I would walk down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral in front of 400 guests, wearing a wire and a wedding dress, ready to record my own husband confessing to the biggest betrayal of my life. It wasn't the wedding I dreamed of as a little girl, but it was the wedding I needed to have to save myself from a man who'd never seen me as anything more than a beautiful, useful object. As I put on my veil and prepared to leave for the cathedral, I thought about my grandmother's advice one more time. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Charles had shown me who he was. Now it was time to show him who I really was. And what I was a woman who refused to be used without consequences. The car was waiting downstairs to take me to my wedding. But I wasn't going as Charles Whitmore's bride anymore. I was going as his judge and jury, wrapped in silk and lace, carrying the evidence that would either vindicate me or destroy us both. Either way, the truth was about to come out. The ride to St. Patrick's Cathedral felt like traveling to my own execution. I sat in the back of the white Rolls-Royce that Charles had insisted on, my hands folded carefully in my lap to avoid wrinkling the dress that had cost more than most people's cars. The recording device felt like it was burning against my skin, even though I knew it was invisible. Jessica kept chattering about how beautiful everything looked, how perfect the weather had turned out to be after the morning drizzle, how this was going to be the wedding of the century. I nodded and smiled at the right moments, but inside I was rehearsing what I needed to say to get Charles to reveal his true intentions. "You're so quiet," Jessica said as we pulled up to the cathedral. "Are you okay?" "Just taking it all in," I said, which was true in a way she couldn't imagine. The cathedral was magnificent. White roses and orchids cascaded from every surface, and the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows made everything look ethereal. 400 guests filled the pews, senators, CEOs, celebrities, and socialites who had come to witness what the society pages were calling the merger of hearts and minds. If only they knew how accurate that description really was. I was whisked into a private room behind the altar to wait for my entrance. Through the partially open door, I could see Charles at the front of the cathedral, looking devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo. He was talking quietly with David Lynch, who was serving as his best man, and I strained to hear their conversation. "Board is thrilled," David was saying. "The diversity optics alone are going to make this the smoothest merger we've ever done." "Keep your voice down," Charles replied, glancing around nervously. "We don't need anyone overhearing that kind of talk today." My blood ran cold. Even now, even at our wedding, they were talking about me like a business asset. "Relax," David said with a laugh. "Everyone here thinks this is a love story. They have no idea how brilliant this strategy really is." "It is a love story," Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I do care about Aaliyah." "Of course you do. She's beautiful, intelligent, and she's going to make you the youngest billionaire in shipping. What's not to love?" I pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The timing has to be perfect," Charles continued. "The merger needs to close completely before things change." 11 months, David said. "That's what we agreed on. Long enough to satisfy the board's requirements, short enough to avoid any real complications." 11 months. Just under the 1-year mark that would trigger my financial protections in the real prenup. They had planned this down to the week. "And you're sure the prenup will hold up?" Charles asked. "My lawyers wrote it. She'll get nothing if the marriage ends before the year mark, and by then the merger will be irreversible. Clean, simple, profitable." I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. Hearing it laid out so coldly, so calculatedly, was worse than finding the documents. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated destruction of my life for the sake of a business deal. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing," Charles said quietly. For a moment, my heart leaped. Maybe there was still some part of him that actually cared about me. Are you kidding me? David said. Charles, this deal is going to make both our families richer than we ever imagined. And all it costs is 1 year of marriage to a woman who's already gotten more out of this relationship than she ever could have dreamed of. Designer clothes, jewelry, access to our world. She should be grateful. You're right, Charles said, and I heard his resolve hardening. It's just whetting nerves. This is the smart play. The only play, David agreed. Your father would be proud. Using marriage as a business strategy. It's exactly the kind of thinking that built the Whitmore fortune in the first place. I backed away from the door, my entire body shaking. The recording device had captured every word, but hearing it felt like being stabbed repeatedly in the chest. Charles wasn't just planning to leave me. He was proud of how cleverly he'd manipulated me. 5 minutes, Miss Johnson, the wedding coordinator said, appearing at my elbow. Are you ready? Ready. Was I ready to walk down that aisle knowing that every word of love Charles spoke would be a lie? Was I ready to say vows to a man who saw me as a temporary inconvenience in his path to greater wealth? Yes, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I'm ready. The music began, Pachelbel's canon, just as we'd rehearsed. The doors opened, and I began the longest walk of my life. 400 people rose to their feet as I entered the cathedral. Camera flashes went off like fireworks. I could hear murmurs of appreciation for my dress, my flowers, the sheer spectacle of it all. But all I could see was Charles at the end of that aisle, watching me approach with what I now recognized as satisfaction rather than love. He thought he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. He had no idea he was about to confess to securities fraud in front of 400 witnesses and a recording device. As I reached the altar, Charles took my hands in his. You look incredible, he whispered, and for just a moment, I almost believed he meant it. The ceremony began with all the traditional pomp and circumstance. The priest spoke about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage while I stood there knowing that the man beside me viewed our union as a temporary business arrangement. When it came time for the vows, Charles went first. He spoke beautifully about how I had changed his life, how I had made him a better man, how he couldn't wait to build a future together. Every word was perfectly crafted, emotionally resonant, and completely hollow. Aaliyah, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, you are my partner in every sense of the word. Together, we're going to accomplish things neither of us could achieve alone. Partner. The word choice was telling. Not soulmate, not love of his life, but partner. Like we were forming a business alliance rather than a marriage. Then it was my turn. I looked out at the sea of faces watching us, at the cameras recording every moment, at David Lynch smirking in the front row like he was watching his favorite movie. Charles, I began, my voice clear and strong. When I first met you, I thought I had found someone who saw me for who I really am. Someone who valued my mind, my heart, my dreams. I paused, letting the words sink in. Charles was smiling, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I believed that when you chose me, it was because you loved me. Not because of what I could do for you, or what I could help you achieve, but because of who I am as a person. The uncertainty in Charles's eyes was growing. This wasn't the vow we had rehearsed. I promised myself that I would be the best wife I could be to you. That I would support your dreams, your ambitions, your goals. That I would be your partner in building something beautiful together. I squeezed his hands, and he squeezed back, probably thinking I was just nervous. But partnerships require honesty, Charles. They require both people to be truthful about their intentions, their feelings, their plans for the future. Now Charles looked genuinely confused. The priest was frowning slightly, clearly sensing that something was off script. So I need to ask you something, here in front of all these people who love us and support us. Charles, are you marrying me because you love me? Or are you marrying me because it helps you close a business deal? The cathedral went dead silent. Charles's face went white, then red, then white again. "Aaliyah," he said carefully, "what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the Lynch Industries merger. I'm talking about the board's requirement for diversity and progressive leadership. I'm talking about the real prenuptial agreement that ensures I get nothing if our marriage ends before the 1-year mark." Gasps echoed through the cathedral. I could see David Lynch frantically shaking his head at Charles, trying to signal him to deny everything. "I'm talking about the conversation you just had with David about how this marriage is a brilliant strategy that will make you the youngest billionaire in shipping." Charles's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Around us, 400 guests were beginning to murmur, their confusion turning to shock as they realized they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a traditional wedding ceremony. "Aaliyah," Charles said, his voice barely audible, "you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" I interrupted. "Then please, explain it to me. Explain to all of us. Tell me about your real plans for our marriage, Charles. Tell me about the timeline you and David worked out. Tell me about what happens 11 months from now." The recording device was capturing every word, every pause, every moment of Charles's growing panic. But more than that, 400 of the most influential people in the country were watching him realize that his perfect plan had just become his perfect nightmare. Charles started, then stopped. He looked at David, who was now standing up in the front pew, clearly ready to intervene. "Tell them, Charles," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Tell them how you chose me not because you loved me, but because I was the perfect accessory for your ambition. Tell them how you plan to use me for a year and then discard me with nothing. That's not—" He began, but his voice trailed off as he realized that denying it would require him to lie in front of 400 witnesses in a cathedral. "Tell them," I repeated, "or I will." And in that moment, standing at the altar in my perfect dress with my perfect flowers, I realized that I had already won. Charles Whitmore had built his entire plan on the assumption that I was powerless, naive, and disposable. He was about to learn how wrong he had been about all three. The silence stretched on, heavy and electric, as Charles struggled to find words that could save him from the trap he had built for himself. But there were no such words. And we both knew it. The silence in the cathedral stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Charles stood there, his mouth opening and closing, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. 400 guests held their breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "I'm waiting, Charles," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the vaulted space. "Tell everyone here why you really proposed to me." David Lynch was on his feet now, his face red with panic. "Charles, don't say another word. We need to." "Sit down, David," I said without taking my eyes off Charles. "You've said enough already." The priest looked completely bewildered. "Perhaps we should take a moment to—" "No," I said firmly. "We're going to finish this right here, right now. Charles, you have 10 seconds to tell the truth, or I'm going to tell it for you." Charles's eyes darted around the cathedral, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. His mother was staring at him with growing horror. His sister had her hand over her mouth. The business leaders and politicians in the audience were beginning to whisper among themselves, their phones already coming out to record what was clearly about to become the scandal of the decade. "Aaliyah, please," Charles whispered. "Can we discuss this privately?" "Privately?" I laughed, and the sound echoed off the stone walls. "Like how you privately planned to destroy my life. Like how you privately discussed using me as a business prop with David." "No, Charles. We're way past private." I turned to address the congregation directly, my voice strong and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you something about the man I was supposed to marry today. Charles Whitmore didn't propose to me because he loved me. He proposed to me because Lynch Industries required his company to demonstrate a commitment to diversity and progressive values before they would approve a merger worth $3 billion. The murmurs in the cathedral grew louder. I could see reporters frantically taking notes, society photographers snapping pictures of Charles's horrified expression. I was chosen not for my heart, but for my skin color. Not for my character, but for my usefulness. Charles Whitmore saw me as the perfect accessory to help him close the biggest deal of his career. That's not true. Charles finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate shout. I do love you, Aaliyah. This is all a misunderstanding. Is it? I reached into my bouquet and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Then explain this. I held up the hidden prenuptial agreement, the one that would leave me with nothing if our marriage ended before the 1-year mark. This is the real prenup, Charles. Not the one your lawyer showed me, but the one you thought I'd never see. The one that ensures I get absolutely nothing if you divorce me in 11 months, right after the Lynch merger closes. Charles's face went ashen. Around us, the cathedral erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. And this, I said, pulling out my phone, is a recording of the conversation you had with David 20 minutes ago, where you discussed the timeline for disposing of me once the deal was done. I pressed play, and Charles's voice filled the cathedral through the sound system. The timing has to be perfect. The merger needs to close completely before things change. David's voice followed. 11 months. That's what we agreed on. Long enough to satisfy the board's requirements, short enough to avoid any real complications. Then Charles again, and you're sure the prenup will hold up? My lawyers wrote it. She'll get nothing if the marriage ends before the year mark, and by then the merger will be irreversible. Clean, simple, profitable. The cathedral exploded. People were shouting, standing up, pointing at Charles and David. Camera flashes went off like strobe lights. I could hear someone calling for security, someone else demanding answers. But I wasn't done. There's more, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. The crowd quieted, hungry for every devastating detail. I played the next part of the recording. David's voice. Charles, this deal is going to make both our families richer than we ever imagined. And all it costs is 1 year of marriage to a woman who's already gotten more out of this relationship than she ever could have dreamed of. Designer clothes, jewelry, access to our world. She should be grateful. Charles's response, you're right. It's just whetting nerves. This is the smart play. The only play. Your father would be proud. Using marriage as a business strategy. It's exactly the kind of thinking that built the Whitmore fortune in the first place. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles looked like he was about to be sick. David Lynch was already pushing his way toward the exit, clearly trying to escape before the legal implications of what they'd just heard caught up with him. Charles, I said, my voice now deadly quiet, do you have anything to say to these people? To your family? To me? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his privileged life, Charles Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say. Then let me say something, I continued. To everyone who came here today expecting to witness a love story, I'm sorry you had to see this instead. But I'm not sorry I stopped it. I turned to face the congregation fully, my wedding dress rustling around me like armor. Charles Whitmore thought he could use me and throw me away. He thought I was too naive, too grateful, too powerless to fight back. He was wrong on all counts. I looked directly at Victoria Whitmore, Charles's mother, who was staring at her son with a mixture of horror and disgust. Mrs. Whitmore, you raised a son who thinks women are commodities to be traded for business advantage. I hope you're proud of the man he's become. Then I turned to David Lynch, who had stopped his escape attempt and was now frozen in the aisle. Mr. Lynch, your company's board might be interested to know that the diversity initiative they thought they were supporting was actually an elaborate fraud designed to manipulate them into approving a merger. I'm sure the SEC will be very interested in that information as well. David's face went white. Securities fraud was a federal crime, and we both knew it. Finally, I turned back to Charles, who was still standing at the altar like a statue. And you, Charles? You wanted a business transaction disguised as a marriage. Congratulations, you're about to get the business consequences of fraud instead. I began walking back down the aisle, my head held high, my dress trailing behind me like a victory banner. The congregation parted before me, some people applauding, others too shocked to move. As I reached the doors of the cathedral, I turned back one last time. Oh, and Charles? The recording I just played? That was just a preview. I have hours of conversations between you and David discussing your plans for me. Lynch Industries has already heard them all. Their legal team is very interested in pursuing securities fraud charges. Charles finally found his voice. Aaliyah, wait. We can work this out. I smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile I'd had in months. No, Charles. We can't. Because you see, while you were planning to use me, I was planning something too. I was planning to make sure that when you showed me who you really were, the whole world would see it. I walked out of St. Patrick's Cathedral and into the afternoon sunlight, leaving behind 400 shocked guests, a humiliated groom, and the wreckage of what was supposed to be the perfect wedding. But as I stood on those cathedral steps, still wearing my wedding dress, but no longer anyone's bride, I realized something important. I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. My phone was already buzzing with calls from reporters, lawyers, and business contacts who had heard about what just happened. The story would be on every news channel within the hour. Charles Whitmore's reputation was destroyed, the Lynch merger was dead, and I had evidence of securities fraud that would keep both men busy with federal investigators for years to come. But more than that, I had something Charles had tried to take away from me: my dignity, my power, and my future. He had planned to use me and discard me. Instead, I had exposed him and walked away victorious. As I stood there in the sunlight, still wearing the dress he had paid for, I realized that Charles Whitmore had given me the greatest gift of all, even though he hadn't meant to. He had shown me exactly how strong I really was. And now the whole world knew it too. The war wasn't over yet. There would be legal battles, media scrutiny, and the challenge of rebuilding my life from the ashes of this betrayal. But I had won the most important battle of all, the battle for my own worth. And that victory was just the beginning. The media storm that followed my cathedral revelation was unlike anything I could have imagined. Within hours, video footage of Charles's humiliation was trending on every social media platform. Billionaire Groom exposed at altar dominated news cycles. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, legal threats, and messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. But the victory I'd felt walking out of that cathedral was short-lived. Charles Whitmore might have been publicly humiliated, but he was still a billionaire with an army of lawyers, and I had just declared war on one of the most powerful families in America. The first blow came within 48 hours. I returned to my apartment to find an eviction notice taped to my door. The building was owned by a subsidiary of Whitmore Holdings. Apparently, my lease had been terminated due to breach of conduct clauses. I called my lawyer, but he wouldn't take my calls. When I finally reached his assistant, she informed me that the firm could no longer represent me due to conflicts of interest. 3 other law firms gave me the same response. The Whitmore influence ran deeper than I'd realized. My consulting business collapsed next. Every single client canceled their contracts within a week, citing reputational concerns and changing business needs. Companies that had praised my work for years suddenly couldn't distance themselves from me fast enough. The corporate world was closing ranks, and I was on the outside. "I'm sorry, Aaliyah," my biggest client told me over the phone. "What you did took courage, but we can't afford to be associated with this kind of controversy. Charles Whitmore sits on half the boards in this city." The financial pressure was crushing. Without my business income, I couldn't afford my apartment even if I hadn't been evicted. My savings, which had seemed substantial, were rapidly depleting as I tried to find new legal representation and keep my business afloat. But the professional destruction was nothing compared to the personal isolation that followed. Jessica, my maid of honor and best friend since college, stopped returning my calls after the third day. When I finally cornered her at her office, she looked genuinely afraid to be seen with me. "Aaliyah, I can't," she said, glancing around nervously. "My husband's firm does business with Whitmore Holdings. If they see us together." "Jessica, we've been friends for 8 years. I know, and I'm sorry. But I have a family to think about. A mortgage. Kids who need to go to college. I can't risk everything for this." One by one, my social circle evaporated. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unreturned. People who had celebrated my engagement now crossed the street to avoid me. The same society that had welcomed me as Charles's fiancée now treated me like a pariah. The media attention, which had initially felt vindicating, turned vicious. Tabloids dug into every aspect of my life, painting me as a gold digger who had manipulated my way into Charles's world only to destroy him when I didn't get what I wanted. "Scorned Bride's Revenge Plot," read one headline. "The Real Aaliyah Johnson, Ambitious Social Climber or Innocent Victim," read another. They found photos of me at charity galas, at business dinners, at society events, and used them to craft a narrative of calculated social climbing. They interviewed people from my past who were willing to say anything for money, painting me as someone who had always been obsessed with wealth and status. The worst part was that some of it was working. Public opinion was shifting. The initial sympathy for the betrayed bride was being replaced by suspicion about my motives. Comment sections filled with people questioning whether I had known about Charles's plans all along and was just angry that I'd been caught. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was living in a studio apartment in Queens, having sold most of my jewelry and designer clothes to pay for basic expenses. My consulting business was dead, my reputation was in ruins, and I was facing a mountain of legal bills I couldn't afford. That's when Charles made his next move. The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope. Charles was suing me for defamation, breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and something called tortious interference with business relationships. He was seeking $50 million in damages. I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, surrounded by legal documents I couldn't afford to fight, and finally broke down. The tears I'd been holding back for weeks came pouring out, along with all the fear and desperation I'd been trying to suppress. Charles wasn't just trying to destroy my reputation or my business. He was trying to destroy me completely, to make sure I never recovered from daring to expose him. The lawsuit was designed to bankrupt me, to force me into a settlement that would include a non-disclosure agreement, effectively silencing me forever. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, hoping it might be a lawyer willing to take my case. "Ms. Johnson? This is Rebecca Martinez from the New York Times. I'm working on a follow-up story about your situation, and I wanted to give you a chance to respond to some allegations." "What allegations?" "We've received information suggesting that you may have been involved in planning the merger fraud from the beginning. That your relationship with Charles Whitmore was a mutual deception designed to manipulate Lynch Industries." My blood ran cold. "That's completely false. We have sources who say you were aware of the merger discussions from early in your relationship. That you actively participated in strategy sessions about how to present the relationship to Lynch's board." I realized what was happening. Charles was fighting back, using his media connections to plant stories that would make me look like a co-conspirator rather than a victim. If he could convince people that I had been in on the scheme from the beginning, it would destroy any sympathy I had left and make his lawsuit seem justified. "Ms. Johnson, do you have any comment on these allegations?" I hung up without answering. Within hours, the story was online, complete with anonymous sources and carefully worded implications that painted me as an ambitious woman who had helped orchestrate the fraud and then turned on Charles when the relationship soured. The narrative was shifting again, and this time it was shifting against me in a way that felt insurmountable. That night, I sat in my studio apartment, eating ramen noodles and staring at the stack of legal documents that represented my financial ruin. I thought about my grandmother, about the lessons she'd tried to teach me about strength and resilience. But I couldn't see how those lessons applied to this situation. Charles Whitmore had more money, more power, more connections, and more resources than I could ever hope to match. He could afford to wage a legal war for years. He could plant stories in the media, pressure my former friends and colleagues, and systematically destroy every aspect of my life. I was one woman with no money, no allies, and no apparent way to fight back against a machine designed to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Maybe I should have just gone through with the wedding, taken what I could get for a year, and walked away quietly when Charles divorced me. At least then I would have had something to show for my humiliation. Now I had nothing but debt, isolation, and the growing certainty that Charles Whitmore was going to win after all. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should have kept your mouth shut. This is just the beginning." I turned off the phone and pulled the covers over my head, wondering if there was any way back from the hole I had dug for myself. Outside my window, the city hummed with life and possibility, but it felt like it belonged to a different world now. A world where I had once been successful, respected, and loved. A world that Charles Whitmore had systematically taken away from me, piece by piece, until all I had left was the truth and the growing fear that the truth wasn't going to be enough to save me. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be powerful, to be in control of my own destiny. But all I could remember was the look of satisfaction on Charles's face as I'd walked down that aisle, thinking I was about to expose him when he was actually about to destroy me more completely than I'd ever imagined possible. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, I was starting to think I might lose it. I woke up on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the wedding to find my bank account frozen. Charles's lawyers had convinced a judge that I posed a flight risk with stolen assets. Apparently, the engagement ring I'd returned and the designer clothes I'd sold were considered marital property, despite the fact that we'd never actually gotten married. I stared at the bank's automated message on my phone screen, the words blurring through tears of exhaustion and despair. I had exactly $43 in cash, no access to my accounts, and rent due in 2 days on an apartment I could barely afford even when I had money. That's when my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Ms. Johnson? This is Elena Rodriguez from the Department of Justice, Securities, and Exchange Commission. We need to talk." I almost hung up, assuming it was another reporter or lawyer trying to trick me into saying something incriminating. But something in her voice made me pause. "I'm listening. We've been investigating the Lynch-Whitmore merger based on the evidence you provided. We'd like to offer you a deal." "What kind of deal?" "Immunity from prosecution in exchange for your full cooperation in building a case against Charles Whitmore and David Lynch for securities fraud." I sat down hard on my second-hand couch. "Immunity from what prosecution? I didn't commit any crimes." "Ms. Johnson, Charles Whitmore's legal team has been very persuasive in suggesting that you were a co-conspirator in the fraud. They've provided evidence that you attended strategy meetings, that you were aware of the merger discussions, that you actively participated in crafting the public narrative around your relationship." My stomach dropped. "That's not. I mean, yes, I attended some business dinners, but I didn't know what they were really planning." "We believe you. But proving that in court without your cooperation would be difficult. Whitmore has resources, connections, and a legal team that's already managed to convince several media outlets that you were in on the scheme from the beginning." I thought about the New York Times article, about the anonymous sources painting me as an ambitious social climber who had helped orchestrate the fraud. Charles was systematically destroying my credibility, making it impossible for anyone to see me as a victim rather than a perpetrator. What exactly are you asking me to do? Testify before a grand jury. Provide detailed testimony about every conversation you overheard, every meeting you attended, every piece of evidence you gathered. Help us build an airtight case against both men. And in exchange? Full immunity from prosecution, witness protection if necessary, and a chance to see justice done. I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what this meant. Testifying against Charles would make me a target in ways I couldn't even imagine. But it might also be my only chance to fight back against the machine that was systematically destroying my life. There's something else, Elena continued. We've been investigating Whitmore Holdings' business practices more broadly. What you exposed about the Lynch merger was just the tip of the iceberg. Charles Whitmore has been using fraudulent diversity initiatives to manipulate business deals for years. You're not his first victim, Ms. Johnson. You're just the first one brave enough to speak up. The words hit me like a physical blow. There were others? At least 3 other women over the past 5 years. Different scenarios, but the same basic pattern. Whitmore would enter into relationships with accomplished women of color, use those relationships to secure business advantages, then discard the women when they were no longer useful. I felt sick. What happened to them? Non-disclosure agreements. Financial settlements that came with gag orders. They were silenced, and Whitmore learned from each experience how to make his schemes more sophisticated. So I'm not special. I'm just the latest in a series of women he's used and thrown away. No, Ms. Johnson. You're the first one who fought back. You're the first one who refused to be silenced. And, because of that, we finally have a chance to stop him. I thought about those other women, about how they must have felt when they realized they'd been used. How they must have struggled with the choice between fighting back and accepting a settlement that would at least give them some financial security. If I testify, what happens to my life? Charles has already destroyed my business, my reputation, my relationships. His lawsuit is going to bankrupt me even if I win. The Justice Department has a victim compensation fund. If Whitmore is convicted, you'd be eligible for restitution that would cover your losses and then some. More importantly, you'd have the satisfaction of knowing that he can't do this to anyone else. I walked to my tiny window and looked out at the city where I'd once felt so powerful, so in control of my destiny. Now I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Ms. Johnson, I need to be honest with you about something else. If you don't cooperate with us, if you try to fight this alone, Charles Whitmore is going to destroy you completely. He has unlimited resources and no conscience. He will bankrupt you, discredit you, and make sure you never recover from this. And if I do cooperate, you'll have the full weight of the federal government behind you. We'll protect you, support you, and make sure that when this is over, Charles Whitmore is the one who's destroyed, not you. I closed my eyes and thought about my grandmother, about the strength she'd shown in raising me after my parents died. About the lessons she'd tried to teach me about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. There's one more thing you should know, Elena said. We've been monitoring Whitmore's communications since you provided that initial evidence. He's planning something big for next week. A press conference where he's going to announce that you've agreed to a settlement and will be making a public apology for your false accusations. What? I haven't agreed to anything. We know. But he's planning to claim that you have, probably with a forged settlement agreement. It's a desperate move, but it might work if we don't act first. The pieces clicked into place. Charles wasn't just trying to destroy me, he was trying to rewrite history, to make it look like I had admitted to lying about him. It was brilliant and evil and exactly the kind of thing a man with unlimited resources and no conscience would do. How long do I have to decide? The grand jury convenes Monday morning. If you're going to testify, we need your answer by tomorrow. After Elena hung up, I sat in my studio apartment and faced the impossible choice that would determine the rest of my life. I could cooperate with the Justice Department, testify against Charles, and hope that the federal government could protect me from his retaliation. It would mean reliving every moment of my humiliation in front of a grand jury, exposing every detail of how I'd been manipulated and used. But it might also mean justice, not just for me but for the other women he'd victimized. Or I could try to fight this alone, knowing that Charles had more money, more power, and more connections than I could ever hope to match. Knowing that he was planning to forge a settlement agreement and claim I'd admitted to lying. Knowing that without the government's protection, he would probably succeed in destroying me completely. That night, I called my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Marie, the only family I had left. I hadn't spoken to her since the wedding disaster, partly out of shame and partly because I didn't want to drag her into my mess. "Aaliyah, baby," she said when she heard my voice. "I've been so worried about you. I saw what happened on the news. Aunt Marie, I don't know what to do. I'm in trouble and I don't see a way out. Tell me what's happening." I told her everything, about the Justice Department's offer, about the other women Charles had victimized, about the choice I had to make. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother used to tell me about the Underground Railroad," she finally said. "About how the conductors had to make impossible choices every day. Help one person escape and risk exposing the whole network. Stay silent and let people suffer in slavery. This isn't the same thing, isn't it? You have a chance to stop a powerful man from hurting other women. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's going to cost you. But some fights are worth having, even when you can't be sure you'll win. What if I lose everything? Baby, you've already lost everything. Your business, your reputation, your friends, it's all gone. The only question now is whether you're going to let him take your dignity and your power too, or whether you're going to fight back." After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment and made my decision. Charles Whitmore thought he could use me and discard me, then destroy me when I fought back. He thought his money and power made him untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I picked up my phone and called Elena Rodriguez. "I'll testify," I said. "I'll tell them everything. Are you sure? Once we start this process, there's no going back." I thought about the other women Charles had silenced, about the ones who might come after me if he wasn't stopped. I thought about my grandmother's lessons about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. "I'm sure. Let's destroy him." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Charles Whitmore had made one crucial mistake in his campaign to destroy me. He had assumed that I would eventually break, that the pressure would become too much and I would give up. But I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every woman he had victimized, every woman he might victimize in the future, and every person who had ever been used and discarded by someone with more power. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time since I'd walked out of that cathedral, I felt like I might actually win. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had never felt more imposing than it did on the morning I was scheduled to testify before the grand jury. I stood on the steps, wearing a simple navy suit I'd bought at a discount store, watching news vans line the street and reporters jostle for position behind police barriers. Elena Rodriguez met me at the security checkpoint, her expression serious but encouraging. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, though my hands were shaking as I signed in. "Remember, just tell the truth. Don't embellish, don't speculate, just stick to what you saw and heard. The evidence speaks for itself." What I didn't know was that while I was preparing to testify, Charles was across town at the Whitmore Holdings headquarters, holding the press conference Elena had warned me about. He stood behind a mahogany podium in a conference room filled with reporters, looking every inch the wronged billionaire seeking justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice steady and confident, "I'm here today to announce that this unfortunate situation has been resolved. Ms. Aaliyah Johnson has agreed to a settlement and will be making a public apology for her false and defamatory statements." He held up what appeared to be a legal document, though the cameras were too far away to see the details. Ms. Johnson has acknowledged that her accusations were motivated by personal disappointment rather than fact, and she deeply regrets the harm her statements have caused to my reputation and my family's business. What Charles didn't know was that the FBI had been monitoring his communications for weeks. They knew about the forged settlement agreement, about the planned press conference, about his desperate attempt to control the narrative before I could testify. And they were recording every word. In the grand jury room, I sat at a simple table facing 23 citizens who would decide whether there was enough evidence to formally charge Charles Whitmore with securities fraud. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Ferdinand, guided me through my testimony with careful precision. Ms. Johnson, please tell the grand jury about the conversation you overheard between Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Lynch on your wedding day. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice growing stronger with each word. I told them about the merger discussions, about the timeline designed to dispose of me just before the 1-year mark, about Charles's admission that using marriage as a business strategy was exactly the kind of thinking that built the Whitmore fortune. And you recorded this conversation? Yes. I was wearing a wire provided by Lynch Industries' legal team. The recording played in the silent courtroom, Charles's voice filling the space with damning clarity. I watched the grand jurors' faces as they heard him discuss me like a business asset, saw their expressions shift from curiosity to disgust. But the most devastating evidence was yet to come. Ms. Johnson, are you aware that the FBI has uncovered similar patterns of behavior by Mr. Whitmore with other women? I've been told there were others, yes. Sarah Ferdinand nodded to an FBI agent, who wheeled in a cart loaded with boxes of documents. We've identified 3 other women over the past 5 years who were involved in relationships with Charles Whitmore that followed the same pattern. Accomplished women of color who were used to secure business advantages, then discarded when they were no longer useful. She opened the first box and pulled out a thick file. Maria Santos, a prominent immigration lawyer. Mr. Whitmore dated her for 8 months while his company was bidding on a government contract that required demonstrated commitment to Latino community outreach. The relationship ended 2 weeks after the contract was awarded. Another file. Dr. Keisha Williams, a renowned surgeon and medical researcher. Mr. Whitmore pursued her while seeking approval for a medical device manufacturing facility. Her expertise and reputation helped him navigate regulatory hurdles. The relationship ended immediately after the facility was approved. A third file. Jennifer Chang, a tech entrepreneur whose company specialized in supply chain software. Mr. Whitmore dated her while negotiating a major contract with an Asian shipping consortium. The relationship ended the day after the contract was signed. I felt sick listening to the pattern laid out so clearly. Charles hadn't just used me, he had turned the exploitation of successful women into a systematic business strategy. Each of these women was offered a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement when the relationship ended, Sarah Ferdinand continued. Each was told that speaking publicly about their experiences would result in legal and financial consequences they couldn't afford to fight. But Ms. Johnson was different, the FBI agent added. She refused to be silenced. And, because of her courage, we were able to uncover this pattern of fraud that spans multiple years and multiple victims. The grand jury was riveted. I could see the anger in their faces, the recognition that they were hearing about something far more serious than a simple business dispute. There's more, Sarah Ferdinand said. We've also uncovered evidence that Mr. Whitmore has been systematically defrauding investors by inflating the value of his diversity initiatives. He's been claiming millions of dollars in tax credits and government incentives for programs that existed only on paper. She pulled out financial documents, emails, internal memos that painted a picture of a man who had turned social justice into a profit center, exploiting both the women he dated and the system designed to promote equality. The Lynch Industries merger was just the latest and largest example of this fraud. Mr. Whitmore stood to gain $3 billion from a deal that was secured through deliberate deception about his company's values and practices. As I sat there listening to the full scope of Charles's crimes being laid out, I realized that what had happened to me was part of something much bigger and more sinister than I'd ever imagined. I hadn't just been the victim of a cruel man. I'd been the target of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The testimony continued for 3 hours. I answered every question, provided every detail, relived every moment of my humiliation for the sake of justice. When it was over, I felt drained but also strangely liberated. "Thank you, Miss Johnson," the grand jury foreman said as I prepared to leave. "Your courage in coming forward has exposed crimes that might never have been discovered otherwise." As I walked out of the courthouse, Elena Rodriguez was waiting with news that made my heart race. "Charles just finished his press conference," she said with a grim smile. "He announced that you'd agreed to a settlement and would be apologizing for your false accusations. But I never. We know. And so does the FBI." They recorded the entire press conference, including his presentation of the forged settlement agreement. He just committed perjury and fraud in front of 50 reporters and live television cameras. My phone started buzzing with calls from journalists who had been at Charles's press conference and were now demanding to know why I was at the federal courthouse instead of making the public apology he'd promised. What do I tell them? Tell them the truth. Tell them that Charles Whitmore is a liar who just committed multiple felonies on live television. Tell them that the real story is just beginning. That afternoon, I held my own press conference on the courthouse steps. The contrast with Charles's polished corporate presentation couldn't have been starker. I stood alone, without lawyers or publicists, speaking directly to the cameras with nothing but the truth. "This morning, Charles Whitmore told you that I had agreed to a settlement and would be apologizing for false accusations," I began. "That was a lie. I have never agreed to any settlement, and I will never apologize for exposing the truth about what he did to me and to other women." I held up my phone, showing the timestamp of my location during Charles's press conference. "While Mr. Whitmore was lying to you about a settlement that doesn't exist, I was inside that courthouse behind me, testifying before a federal grand jury about his crimes. Not just against me, but against multiple women over multiple years." The reporters erupted with questions, but I continued speaking. "Charles Whitmore is not the victim of a vindictive ex-fiancé. He is a criminal who has been systematically defrauding investors, exploiting women, and manipulating the system for his own profit. The evidence I provided today will show that what happened to me was part of a pattern of behavior that spans years and involves millions of dollars in fraud." I paused, looking directly into the cameras. "To the other women who Charles Whitmore has victimized and silenced, you are not alone. Your experiences matter. Your voices matter. And now, finally, there will be consequences for what he did to you." As I walked away from the courthouse, my phone exploded with calls and messages. But this time, they weren't threats or legal demands. They were offers of support, requests for interviews, and messages from women who had been afraid to speak up before but were now ready to tell their stories. The tide had turned. Charles Whitmore's attempt to control the narrative had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing me, he had exposed himself as a liar and a criminal on national television. Within hours, the grand jury returned their decision. Charles Whitmore and David Lynch would be indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and perjury. The man who had tried to use me and discard me, who had attempted to destroy my life when I fought back, was about to face the full weight of the federal justice system. And I was no longer his victim. I was the woman who had brought him down. The war was almost over. And I had won. But the best part was yet to come. Because Charles Whitmore was about to learn that the consequences of his actions extended far beyond criminal charges. His entire empire was about to crumble, and I was going to have a front row seat to watch it happen. 6 months after that federal courthouse press conference, I stood in the penthouse office of my new consulting firm, looking out at the Manhattan skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The irony wasn't lost on me. This office was 3 blocks from Whitmore Holdings headquarters, where Charles was probably packing up his personal belongings under FBI supervision. The indictments had come down like dominoes. Charles and David Lynch were facing 23 counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, perjury, and racketeering. The FBI had frozen their assets, seized their companies, and turned their lives into the kind of legal nightmare that money couldn't buy your way out of. But the criminal charges were just the beginning. The civil lawsuits started within days of the indictments. Lynch Industries sued Whitmore Holdings for fraud and breach of contract, seeking $3 billion in damages. The other women Charles had victimized came forward with their own lawsuits, armed with evidence and no longer bound by the non-disclosure agreements that had silenced them. Maria Santos, the immigration lawyer, filed suit for $10 million. Dr. Keisha Williams sought $15 million. Jennifer Chang demanded $20 million. Each lawsuit detailed the same pattern of manipulation, exploitation, and disposal that I had experienced. It's like watching a house of cards collapse, Elena Rodriguez told me over lunch last week. Every day we uncover new evidence of fraud, new victims, new crimes. Charles Whitmore didn't just run a shipping company, he ran a criminal enterprise. The media coverage was relentless and devastating. The same reporters who had initially painted me as a vindictive gold digger were now writing exposés about Charles's systematic exploitation of women and investors. The society pages that had once celebrated our engagement now ran headlines like "The Predator in a Tuxedo" and "How a Billionaire Built His Fortune on Lies." Victoria Whitmore, Charles's mother, had publicly disowned him and donated $50 million to organizations supporting women's rights and victims of fraud. "I raised a monster," she told Vanity Fair in a cover story that became the most-read article in the magazine's history. "I failed as a mother, and innocent women paid the price for my failure." Emma, Charles's sister, had changed her last name and moved to Europe, telling anyone who would listen that she was ashamed to be related to him. The Whitmore family name, once synonymous with American business success, was now toxic. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months ago, when Charles's assets were liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. I watched from the gallery as federal marshals auctioned off his art collection, his cars, his real estate, even the engagement ring he'd given me. Everything he'd used to project an image of success and sophistication was sold to compensate the people he'd destroyed. The final sale price was $230 million. After legal fees and administrative costs, each of his victims received full restitution plus punitive damages. My share was $47 million, more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching Charles Whitmore, the man who had thought he could use me and throw me away, let out of that courtroom in handcuffs to begin a 25-year federal prison sentence. "Do you have anything to say to your victims?" a reporter shouted as the marshals walked him past the cameras. Charles looked directly at me, his face a mask of rage and defeat. "This isn't over," he said. I smiled and spoke loud enough for the cameras to pick up my response. "Yes, it is. Today, I'm the CEO of Phoenix Strategic Solutions, a consulting firm that specializes in helping companies implement genuine diversity and inclusion programs. My client list includes Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations that want to do the right thing rather than just appear to do the right thing." The name Phoenix wasn't accidental. I chose it because I had literally risen from the ashes of my old life, stronger and more powerful than I'd ever been before. My personal life had been transformed as well. 6 weeks after Charles's sentencing, I met Dr. Edward Thompson at a conference on corporate ethics. He was a professor of business law at Columbia, a brilliant man who had followed my case and wanted to interview me for a book he was writing about corporate fraud. Our first coffee meeting turned into a 4-hour conversation about justice, redemption, and the responsibility that comes with power. Our second meeting turned into dinner. Our third turned into a weekend in the Hamptons where we talked until sunrise about our dreams for the future. Edward was everything Charles had pretended to be: intelligent, principled, genuinely interested in making the world a better place. When he looked at me, he saw a partner, not a prop. When he introduced me to his colleagues, it was because he was proud of my mind, not my usefulness to his career. "You know what I love most about you," he told me last month as we walked along the beach near his family's house in Martha's Vineyard. "You could have let what Charles did to you make you bitter and cynical. Instead, you used it to become someone who protects other people from going through the same thing." We were engaged now, but this time it felt completely different. There were no cameras, no society reporters, no business implications. Just two people who had found each other and wanted to build something real together. The wedding was planned for next spring, a small ceremony with family and close friends, the kind of celebration that was about love rather than spectacle. Edward had insisted on a prenup, not to protect his assets, but to protect mine. "You've earned your independence," he said. "I never want you to feel like you're giving that up for me." But perhaps the most meaningful change in my life was the work I was doing with other victims of corporate fraud and exploitation. I had started a foundation called the Truth and Justice Project, which provided legal support and financial assistance to people fighting powerful corporations and individuals. "You saved my life," Maria Santos told me at our foundation's first annual gala. Not just by exposing Charles, but by showing me that it was possible to fight back and win. Dr. Keisha Williams had become one of my closest friends and a board member of the foundation. "What Charles did to us was horrible," she said during her speech that night. But what Aaliyah did in response was heroic. She turned our pain into power, our victimization into victory. The foundation had already helped dozens of people take on corporations, corrupt politicians, and abusive employers. We had a team of lawyers, investigators, and advocates who specialized in cases where individuals were fighting systems designed to silence them. "The powerful count on the powerless staying silent," I told the audience that night. "They count on us being too afraid, too isolated, too overwhelmed to fight back. Our job is to prove them wrong." As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of survivors, advocates, and allies, I thought about how far I'd come from that terrified woman in the bridal suite, discovering that the man she loved had never loved her back. Charles Whitmore had tried to use me as a stepping stone to greater wealth and power. Instead, he had created his own destroyer. He had thought he was manipulating a naive woman who would be grateful for whatever scraps he threw her way. Instead, he had awakened a force that would ultimately bring down his entire criminal enterprise. The last I heard, Charles was in federal prison in Pennsylvania, sharing a cell with a man convicted of tax evasion. His appeals had been denied, his assets were gone, and his name was synonymous with corporate fraud and the exploitation of women. David Lynch was in a minimum security facility in Connecticut, serving a 15-year sentence and reportedly writing a memoir about his fall from grace. Early reports suggested he was still trying to paint himself as a victim of Charles's manipulation rather than a willing co-conspirator. Neither man would be eligible for parole for at least a decade. Meanwhile, I was living a life I could never have imagined when I first walked into that cathedral wearing a wire and a wedding dress. I had love, success, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from turning your worst experience into your greatest strength. My phone buzzed with a text from Edward. "Dinner at 8? I have something important to ask you." I smiled, knowing that whatever he wanted to discuss, it would be honest, straightforward, and motivated by love rather than ambition. That was the difference between a real partnership and the performance I'd almost committed my life to. As I gathered my things to leave the office, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was confident, powerful, and genuinely happy. She bore little resemblance to the broken, isolated person who had sat in a studio apartment in Queens, wondering if she would survive Charles Whitmore's campaign to destroy her. That woman had survived. More than that, she had thrived. Before I left, I did something I'd been doing every day for the past 6 months. I opened my laptop and checked the news for any updates on Charles's case. Not because I was obsessed with revenge, but because I wanted to make sure he stayed exactly where he belonged. Today's headline made me smile. Disgraced billionaire Charles Whitmore denied appeal, will serve full 25-year sentence. Justice had been served. The truth had prevailed. And the woman Charles Whitmore had tried to use and discard had become the architect of his complete and total downfall. I closed the laptop and headed home to the man who loved me for who I really was, to the life I had built from the ashes of betrayal, to the future that belonged entirely to me. Charles Whitmore had taught me an important lesson, though not the one he'd intended. He had shown me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resilient than I'd ever known, and more powerful than anyone who tried to diminish me could ever understand. And for that lesson, despite everything he'd put me through, I was almost grateful. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this story of justice, resilience, and the power of refusing to be silenced. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let others define their worth. Have you ever had to stand up to someone more powerful than you? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent and fighting for what's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, no matter how powerless you might feel in the face of injustice, you have more strength than you know. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth, keep standing up for what's right, and never let anyone convince you that you're not worth fighting for. Because you are. And your story matters.